Hello, everyone. You're listening to Evidence for Faith. This is the Christian Evidences and Worldview radio program that helps Christians become thinkers and thinkers become Christians. Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis.
And I'm Keith Kendricks.
Keith, it's good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back, Mike. This is the show where we talk philosophy, religion, science, and we're going to be talking about an interesting religious idea, a theological idea called Molinism.
And
today.
We're going to get into good and evil.
Yep. And we're also going to talk about the Old Testament. Is it mythology or not? If you'd like to join us, you can give us a call at 609-398-1020. And you can also check us out at evidenceforfaith.com. That's evidence, the number 4, faith.com. We've got archived shows there for you to listen to. We also have a way that you can contact us by email. And if you want to email us during the show, we are up and receiving emails live. You can listen to us. If you're listening to us by podcast, by the archive shows, you can also listen to us live at the WIBG website, WIBG.com. Press the Listen Live button.
And you can do that really from anywhere around the world.
That's right. We do have people in other states listening to us.
Okay. But you know what, Keith, before we get into the meat of the show, there's one little scientific blurb that I want to share with our listening audience. And this is a Fox News item, and it has to do with global warming. And as all of you know, the nation has been gripped in this cold weather snap, and it's really perplexing a lot of the scientists who were global warming proponents, but
Right.
realize now that they no longer call it global warming because the truth is now known that the cyclical nature of the climate and the weather warming patterns that we've noticed for the last 10 or 15 years are really related to sunspot activity.
Right.
And not necessarily a true warming trend.
That's right. We've been over some of that on the show.
Correct. Now, one of the UN's top global warming proponents, I guess in an attempt to rescue this whole notion, is touting now that there's going to be a mini ice age now for the next 30 or so years.
Right.
So, because the oranges are freezing and crops are being lost
Right.
and tropical fish are dying off the coast of Florida because of this trend, they're trying to make sense of it. But, I really think that it's it's this Mother Nature thing that they're trying to come up with, and as scientific evidence evolves, they're changing their tune a little bit.
Yeah. The data is simply not matching their models.
Exactly.
But why this is important is because it shows how much the scientific community has been corrupted by political necessity and political aims, such as proving that the earth is warmed up by man. And then if you do that, you can now control industry, you can control big business. And that's what they want to do. But there are other areas that science has been corrupted, and you have to look at the data yourself. You can't just trust just because it's the big guy with the PhD behind his name and he's part of a big institute. You have to look at the data yourself. Now this guy, he's trying to backtrack because everything's been getting colder. So what does he do? He predicts 30 more years of cooling, but we already know that there's a very clear experimental evidence out there that shows that this is matched to the cycle of the sunspots, solar activity, that in general is rising, but it has this cycle of an 11-year period where it cycles. So we're actually at the bottom of the cold part. We've been getting colder from about the year 2000, and it even mentions it in this article that about around the year 2000. Well, it starts to cycle again, so now it's going to get warmer. So the guy's going to be even wrong, even though he's wedged in this 30 years of coldness into his theory. He's going to wind up being wrong because over the next few years, the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to get warmer again.
Yeah, and one of the political motives that motivates these people to tout these ideas is that ultimately, with the one world government that we know that biblically is correct in its prediction, they want to rally people around this concept of saving Mother Earth.
Right.
So that way they can control industry and the various governments around the world and get everybody flying under one flag.
Right.
And
Suppress capitalism.
exactly.
Yeah. And the things that make nations wealthy that we talked about last week with Kirk Hastings, and a big shout out to Kirk Hastings for helping us the last 2 weeks. He did a great job.
You know, Keith, one biblical comment that I want to make before we get off of this topic is that global warming is nothing new. You know, the Bible predicts that there's going to be global warming, and if you want to look it up yourself, you can look at 2 Peter 3:10, and I'll read it for you, those folks who are not familiar with it.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting.
This is what Peter says, and this is 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. In the day of the Lord, it'll come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. So this was the global warning for everybody to get their soul in order, not their affairs, but their soul in order.
Because there's going to be true global warming
big time
coming in the future. Okay, good. Now I want to remind people that I have started a talk on Wednesday nights at Victory Bible Church in Hamilton. I did the Introduction to Apologetics this past Wednesday, and I'll be speaking again, this time on the evidence for the existence of God. So if you'd like to come out and listen and meet me in person, that'd be great. It's at 816 South Egg Harbor Road in Hamilton, Victory Bible Church, and you can look them up online. So it's Wednesdays, it's part of the prayer meeting. So at 7 o'clock we pray for about a half an hour, and then we have about a 20-minute lesson. So for those of you who are interested in coming out, that's going to be every Wednesday night for a couple of months. Now, we are going to get into a philosophical religious discussion that is part of a lecture that I attended down in New Orleans at the Evangelical Philosophical Society meeting, and it was given by William Lane Craig. Now, he is one of the top apologists in the United States, one of maybe the top 5, I'd say. He is in the apologetics world, he is big guns. He is one of the leading debaters and does a fantastic job. Well, he talks about something that comes up because of the issue of the problem with suffering. So let's talk about that a little bit so we can kind of set the stage for this lecture.
And this really gets back to the good and evil argument. Why does God allow suffering, or why does God allow bad things to happen to good people?
And we've talked about that in previous shows. Is what is the explanation? And I have a quote here from Alvin Plantinga. Alvin Plantinga is another big philosophical name in the world of apologetics. And I guess what I'll do is read his quote. He's explaining this solution for why there is evil in the world. Okay? Here's what he says. A world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable. So this kind of a world, he's saying, where individuals are free to perform moral good, is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what is right. Okay? For if he does that, then they aren't significantly free after all, right? They're just like robots. And they do not do what is right freely. So if he makes them do only right things, then they're not free. Okay? The quote continues, to create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. Does that make sense? Okay. He goes on, as it turned out, sadly enough, some of the free creatures that God created went wrong in the exercise of their freedom. This is the source of moral evil. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness, for he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good.
If I can, if I can try to sum that up, Keith, I know that was a mouthful and a brainful of theology as well as philosophy. I think that in basic terms, Plantinga in this Molinistic mindset is basically saying that in addition to knowing everything that does or will happen, God also knows what would happen if he had acted differently than he actually does.
Okay, well, we got to dig into that, because that is the heart of Molinism. But let's set up the issue now a little bit more for our listeners. If we're saying that evil, the solution to the problem of evil is that people have free will, well, now you've got a problem, because there are some Bible verses that seem to indicate that maybe people don't have free will. And there's a whole stream of thought called Calvinism. Now, there are different levels in Calvinism. Some Calvinists believe that there is free will, and others believe that there is no free will, that God is sovereign. The way they would explain it is that God is sovereign, that everything has been predicted ahead of time, that God has planned everything, every action out, and so there's no free will. So now we have this problem, and this debate in Christian circles is the debate between Calvinism and Arminianism. The Arminian view would be that, no, people have free will, and that this is why they're morally guilty before God. You know, if you're not making your own decisions, then how can God judge you? How can God say, you did evil, you must be punished for that evil, if you're not free, right? So that's this big argument. And I'm sure there are many Arminian listeners out there, Arminianist listeners, and there are many Calvinists out there. If you want to jump into the discussion, you can join us at 609-398-1020. You're listening to Evidence for Faith. I'm Keith Kendricks.
And hi, I'm Dr. Michael Arakis.
So that's this big controversy. And there are lots of verses on both sides. There's lots of verses that support Calvinism. I mean, and the Calvinists, boy, they're usually, ready to jump right in and tell you all the verses that support their view because they hold the sovereignty of God very highly. So, not a sparrow falls to the ground unless God knows it. But the question is whether God, not just that he knows it, but whether God is doing it or not. Does God do everything? If he's sovereign, he's the king, is he doing everything? Did he make you, Mike, drive here to the studio today?
No, it was something that I decided to do
along
with you.
But if you're a Calvinist, and an extreme view of the Calvinist, maybe God did make you do everything you do. He's sovereign. He makes you do everything. So he made you come because it was in his will, and there's nothing you could have done about it. So that's a real view out there. Now, are we just stuck with this argument between Calvinism and Arminianism? One says there is free will, one says there's not free will. But we've got verses in the Bible that seem to show both. There are verses about being free and God holding you responsible for your decisions. Okay? But then there are other verses that say, well, God is sovereign. He is in control. He runs the show. Well, that's where Molinism comes in. There's this middle ground. And the name comes from Molina, who was a Jesuit scholar in the Middle Ages. Now, hopefully right away that's not going to throw people off and say, oh, well, he was a Jesuit, so it can't be right. Well, I guess there'd be other people listening who'd say, oh, well, then it must be right. But that's where the term comes from. Molinism. Now, explain again this concept of middle knowledge. Now we're ready to hear, what is this thing, middle knowledge, that Molina said God knows? All right, well, middle knowledge is the idea that God can know things that haven't happened and are never going to happen, essentially. Okay? So, for example, we know that God knows lots of factual things, truths that have to be true. Like, for instance, God knows that there is no such thing as a square circle. Or God knows that all bachelors are unmarried. Okay? Well, that's obvious, right? He knows all those things. He also knows everything that's going to happen in the future, though. Okay? So he knows, he also knows, like, how much the hairs on your head, right? He knows that. That's scriptural. He knows the number of grains of sand. He knows the number of stars. He knows all these factual things about the universe. And he also knows future things. He knows, for instance, the day and hour that I'm going to die, right? He knows how long I'm going to live in, years, months, weeks, days, hours, seconds, nanoseconds. Right? He knows exactly. So he knows all about the future. But he also knows these things that are called counterfactuals, which not only don't happen in the future, but never are going to happen. For instance, he knows what I would do, or if I decided I was going to buy a car today, he knows what car I would buy. Okay, well, am I going to go buy a car today? No, I'm not. But if I did, he knows what kind of car I'm going to buy. Those are things that are that's called middle knowledge. It's a knowledge of things that don't happen or aren't going to happen. So he knows, and it's like saying that God knows every possible world. He knows every possible action that a person can take. He knows you, Mike, so well that he knows exactly what you would do in every possible situation. Now, given that, if God knows that, if God has this thing called middle knowledge, then he can set up the universe in such a way that he can essentially control you, even though you'll still be free. Does that make sense?
Yes. Let me take a stab at it, Keith.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got three basic types of knowledge, okay, according to this doctrine. We have God's knowledge of necessary truths. This is the first type of knowledge, like there are no square circles.
Right.
And these are just factual truths. Okay?
Right.
And the second type of knowledge is God's free knowledge. And this type of knowledge consists of truths that are dependent upon God's will. Okay? And then the third, or the middle knowledge, that's sort of the middle ground in between 1 and 2, describes things that are contingently true but are independent of God's will.
Because they're dependent on your will.
Or my free will.
Or my will, exactly. Right. Because he's created us as free agents.
Right.
And you see how this is kind of a blending then of this problem, this dilemma, this fork in the road. Do we go with Calvinism, which has a lot of biblical support, or do we go with Arminianism, which has a lot of biblical support? We're just stuck. Well, here is a solution to the dilemma, is this Molinism. And that's why it's supported by William Lane Craig, some great thinkers like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga, who believe that this fits all of the scriptural indicators as to the way things run. So God knows what any free agent, so let's give the term for free will a free agency. That means you have the freedom to make choices. When you hire somebody to, like a lawyer, he becomes your agent. That means he can make choices for you. So that's what God has done. He's given us agency. He's given us the ability to make free choices. But God knows what choices we would make in any situation, even if it's not what we would call instantiated, or it becomes an instant, it becomes an actual fact. So or you could call it a counterfactual. Okay? So, and in a sense, then God concurs with the decisions of free agents. So he's, by allowing us the freedom, he's essentially concurring. He's allowing you to do what you want. I always think of it as like God playing on a chessboard, but instead of using just pieces and moving the pieces, he actually has pieces that can make their own decision. And so they, it's good guys against the bad guys, and each side is making their own choices. God's so smart, he is so knowledgeable that he can still win the game, even when the pieces don't play the way he wants them to play. See, he still beats you.
Here's the question of the ages. Did Jesus Christ have free will?
Okay, why do you ask that?
Well, he was placed here for a reason.
Right.
Okay, and he's that chess piece that could have made the decisions.
Ooh, he's like a queen sacrifice to win the game.
So did he or did he not have free will, since his purpose and his birth were already prescripted?
Well, it's kind of cheating though, because he's God too.
Okay.
So so if you ask the question, does God have free will? Answer yes. God has free will.
Okay. God has free will.
Right.
But could Jesus have stepped out of his role to be the sacrifice of all time for all men?
Right.
One
when he
propitiation.
You're talking about when he was on the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was apparently in great
crisis.
Right. Over.
He had hematohydrosis, and that's a term whereby his sweat and his blood were being mixed together because his blood pressure was so high and his arteries and veins were so vasodilated that sweat and blood were pouring out of his pores. Okay, there are only 7 documented cases in the literature. It's a real phenomenon, and people are in extremis when this is happening to them. They're in extreme throes of stress or life and death circumstances, and their adrenal glands are pumping out a mile a minute, and that causes the blood and the sweat to mix. So this was a real phenomenon. He was pouring out his blood and his sweat in the garden while he was praying.
Yeah,
Could he have stepped out of that?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, and I guess we just have to kind of speculate. My guess is that from the human nature point of view, yes, he could, because he came to the earth just like us, is in a human body with a human nature.
And as a human being, he was asking his Father in heaven to take this cup from me.
Right. But on the other hand, he also had to follow his own God nature too, as part of the Trinity. So in a sense, since it was his nature to be humble, to be self-sacrificing, to do the right thing, in a sense, he's not free, or at least his freedom would always express itself in doing the right thing. Unlike you and I, who are free creatures, who don't always express ourselves with the right decision, God and Jesus Christ always expressed his free will in the right way, doing the right thing. How about a different question, though, about Molinism? Can God control all free creatures?
If he could control all free creatures, they would be robots, and the answer is yes, he could, if he desired to.
Right.
But then there would be no need for moral behavior, and certainly there would be no evil behavior.
Right.
But he allows us that free will.
Yes.
Because I believe this goes all the way back to the garden where we ate from the tree of good and evil.
Okay, now you're taking the Arminian view. You're saying that we have free will. God could control us, but he doesn't, right?
Correct.
Okay, well, the Molinist view, this middle view, actually says, yes, God can control free creatures, even though they're free. And he does it because he can change the environment. He can change the situation. He knows all possible worlds, And he knows, for example, Mike, he knew all the circumstances that would lead up to you getting saved. So he set up the situation so that you would get saved. Now, did you freely get saved?
Oh, it took a lot of prayer and a lot of time.
But freely you did, right? He didn't
Indeed.
force you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Correct.
But in a sense, he did by controlling your environment. So that's this interesting blend of this Calvinism that God controls everything, and yet Arminianism that you are still remain free. So is perfect control incompatible with creaturely freedom? Well, Molinism says no, it's not incompatible. That God can perfectly control everything because he's controlling the situations that everyone is in. And he knows how they'll respond in certain situations. So you still act freely, and yet God is still in charge of everything. Is that interesting? That's a really terrific solution to this dilemma.
So, Keith, if there was something that I wanted to get from you, let's say it was top secret information.
Okay.
And I offered you $10,000 to share that top secret information with me.
Right.
Okay. You would not take $10,000 because
Okay.
you are a man of character
All right.
and virtue.
Right.
And you're a God-fearing man, and you know to do what's correct
Right.
and what's right and
Right.
what's morally correct.
Correct.
However, if I up the ante to $1 million, would you sit down and have dinner with me?
Right. I might be more interested. Right.
All right. So
Now God knows. He knows my price.
exactly.
Yeah, so he, in a sense, is in control of me, even though I'm free. Like, I'm free to decline the $10,000, and I'm free to accept the $1 million. Then God simply controls the situation. He knows how much the dollar value that you actually gave me and makes the situation work out that way. So that's what Molinism is, and it really explains all of the seemingly competing verses about free will versus God's sovereignty. You are listening, if you just joined us, you're listening to Evidence for Faith. I'm Keith Kendricks.
And hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis.
You can join the conversation by calling 609-398-1020, or you can email us by going to the evidenceforfaith.com website. That's the number 4, faith.com.
Well,
All
Keith,
right.
this Molinism has some real interesting theological implications, too.
Well, I
Okay.
thought we just went over some.
It's fascinating.
It's got more.
It really is.
What are
Yeah.
some more?
Well, in essence, God retains a measure of his divine providence without necessarily hindering any man's freedom.
Right.
So it's terrific.
Yeah, it seems to answer this. I mean, how many centuries have people been fighting? Well, I guess since John Calvin, I guess. So since John Calvin, there's been this battle royale between Calvinist and Arminian, and this seems to be an elegant solution to that. Well, let's move on to another topic for today. We're going to take a look at the Old Testament versus mythology. Okay? Is the Old Testament mythological, or is the Old Testament opposed to mythology?
Well, in essence, I mean, if you look at the Old Testament text, by and large, it's a historical narrative.
Yes, it's not written as if it's mythology.
Correct. In fact, many of the Old Testament writers were keenly opposed to mythology, including God himself.
Right.
He said, have no other gods before me. Whereas
Yep.
in Greek mythology, how many gods did they have? Too numerous to count.
Right.
So
critics of the Bible say that, well, the Bible's just another form of mythology. It's the creation myth and the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea. This is all mythology and symbolic rather than actual historical stories. Now, C.S. Lewis has said that, hey, I'm an expert in mythology, And let me tell you, when you read the Old Testament, it's nothing like mythology. So he accuses these critics of saying they don't even know what mythology is. If they're saying that the Old Testament is mythological, like mythology of the ancient past, it's not at all like it. It's just like you said, Mike, it's a historical story.
And if you look at critically the Old Testament narrative, it's not even of that genre of mythology.
That's
it really
right.
isn't.
No.
And I would venture to say that most of the critics who just blow it off as mythological probably haven't even read the Old Testament.
Right. One of the major biblical scholars of today is a man named N.T. Wright. And he has shown at great length, very scholarly articles and books, about the difference between the Israelites and their surrounding cultures. And he showed how their primary doctrines are completely different. And he names their primary doctrines as monotheism and iconoclasm, right? Okay, what's iconoclasm? Iconoclasm...
They wanted to tear down all the other idols and false gods.
Exactly. Now,
which means that you would tear down all the mythological gods as well, moving forward into, Greek and Roman culture and so forth.
That's right. So their views were totally different from all of the other cultures around them, and it goes very contrary to this idea that the religion of Israel just developed out of some of the early Semitic religions that the Israelites were living among those people, and they just kind of took different ideas from those religions. Not at all. In fact, it's completely opposed to those kinds of mythological views. Now, historically, about 150, 200 years ago, there was this rise of what we call higher criticism. And scholars were trying to show that the Bible really is mythological, that it's not written history. And for one person, Karl Barth, talked about the Old Testament as being a witness to revelation, right? It's a witness to revelation. It's not revelation. It's not God talking to us. It's a witness to revelation. So you're kind of one step removed from God speaking to us and telling us what actually happened. So, it's history as revelation. Not real history, but it's kind of the Bible giving us a mythology.
The timing of that, Keith, I find very fascinating, because it was 150 years ago that the doctrine, if you want to call it that, of evolution was promoted by Darwin. In 1859.
Oh yeah,
and so the timing of this is actually, I can't escape
all
it.
part of the Enlightenment movement.
Exactly.
Yeah, and trying to throw off the mythology of the past. So then you had a guy named Bultmann, another higher critical scholar, who said that the Bible was myth. That we need to study the Bible as myth, and that this is how to really understand the Bible. But like you said, Mike, the Bible is a different kind of genre. It's it's or a way of writing. It's simply not written as mythology. So what do we mean by myth when we say myth? If somebody says something about myth,
it's made up. It's a story.
It's false.
Not founded in fact.
Right. Yeah. We all so when we talk about the Bible as mythology, they try to say it in a nice way. Well, this is our myth, but really what they're saying is it's false.
The other term that'll frequently be used is these people who reject the Bible. They basically say, "Oh, that's a fairy tale," or the fairy tales that I learned in Sunday school. Okay, so they'll just chalk it up to a fairy tale.
Yeah, if they're going to definitely trash it, yeah, instead of coding it in this sort of sounding good, mythology. It's our myth. And so what else does myth mean? Well, myth is like something that has cultural truths in it, right? So a lot of people think that that's what the Old Testament is, that it has cultural truths, right? what another thing that mythology is about, especially in your non-Judeo Christian narrative, it's about the control over nature, right? That's what a lot of the foreign gods, the cultures that were around the Israelites, that's what their religion was all about. It was about control over nature, the repetitive cycles of harvest, springtime and fall.
Fertility.
Yeah,
It goes on and
exactly.
on
There
and
was a
on.
lot of sex involved in
Sure.
their religions because they felt that they could somehow control through magic and through imitative magic. By imitating nature, by having sex and producing offspring, that you were, in a sense, you could control your environment.
And let me ask the viewers, what does the Bible clearly say about magic?
Right.
It's clearly contrary to biblical doctrine.
Exactly.
Totally.
Yeah, the Old Testament is opposed to all these views. It's opposed to the idea that it's only cultural truths. It's opposed to trying to maintain control over nature. It's opposed to mythology.
It's opposed to idolatry. It's opposed to other gods, false gods, all those things.
Right. Look at the story of the Israelites in Egypt. What were the 10 plagues about?
Destroying all of the false gods
Right.
of the Egyptians.
Right. Each of the plagues was a direct attack on a god of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And so God used this whole series of plagues to prove to the Israelites that this mythology is bunk.
But he also proved it in the same way to the Egyptians.
Yes.
By turning their own gods against them.
That's
and
right.
Plaguing them with all those horrible things.
That's
The
right.
bloody Nile and the locusts and so forth.
Exactly. And let's go back to the creation story, okay, or the creation history. What about the moon? Is the moon a deity?
No, it was a created thing.
Exactly
From day
right.
one.
Or the sun,
Exactly. A created thing.
Right. How
Not
many
a-
cultures worship the sun?
Right. The moon god, the sun god, and the list goes on and on and on.
Right.
Or
worship the earth.
right. Everything in the garden was worshipped at one time or another by some sect on the
Yes.
planet.
That's right. But the Hebrew Old Testament is very, very clear. Those are not gods. God, the true creator of the universe, created all those things. And then, like you said, Mike, it's opposed to this magic idea, this imitative magic, this idea that you can control nature. And, what they were afraid of was being controlled by nature, and the problems and crop failures and things that were so uncontrolled. So they tried to figure out ways to control nature itself or to appease the spirits that were living inside rocks and trees and other things. So, and that, of course, is totally against the teachings of the Old Testament.
Sure, and I think of the chants and the rain dances that the Indians used to do when there was a drought.
That's right.
So
And even the idea that time is cyclical, that it just keeps repeating itself over and over. That there's, just as the sun rises and sets and winter comes and summer comes, that time is cyclical. It just keeps going on and on.
But we know that time is actually progressive.
Right.
There was a beginning, and there will be an end.
That's exactly right. All clearly spelled out in the Old Testament. So again, another area where it's totally against this mythological view. So there's this idea that, what takes place here on the earth is not determined by, some kind of invisible world of gods or a pantheon up in Olympia, where the gods are kind of controlling everything, and you have the gods of anger, or even the ones that inspire artists, all that stuff. They're not being controlled. In fact, the Old Testament says we control our future up there. We control what's going to happen to us after we die. It's not the other way around. It's not the spirit world controlling us, but our choices for good and evil, our choices of worshiping the Creator God, determine how we're going to spend eternity.
Well, and I think the most interesting point that we have to make today, and it's so timely too, is that the world as we know it, the earth, or can I say Mother Earth, forgive me, is not a god.
Right.
But yet we hold this Mother Earth concept up on a pedestal, and everything that seems to be happening in social circles and political circles is centered around Mother Earth.
Right.
In fact, I've said it once before, and I'll say it again many times, that this whole concept of evolution, as opposed to a creator God, this concept of evolution is the illegitimate union of Father Time and Mother Earth.
Uh-huh.
So I'm going to use two gods that modern science is currently using to promote their agenda by saying Mother Earth was illegitimately bound to Father God.
Father Time.
Father Time, right,
Yeah.
to spawn this movement.
Right. This is similar to the movie Avatar, where you have this nature worship, this kind of spiritual energy in all living things, heavily promoted in this movie. And it's
a blockbuster.
Yeah, it's being promoted in our culture. One of the interesting things is that the Israelites didn't like the Old Testament. They didn't like this idea of God being against mythology. They did everything they could to try to avoid there being a true God who created the universe. They wanted to worship a calf.
Oh, yeah. And they were commanded not to mingle and mix with the Canaanite women.
But they loved the Canaanite religion and other religions.
Sure, it was easy.
Right.
Being a monotheist and having no other gods and listening to the Word of God and the commandments, that's hard stuff.
Right. So how do you explain the appearance of the Old Testament in history? Well, it has to be that God really did reveal himself to the human race through the Israelite people, and that the texts that we have today are actually historical texts that do reveal God and his intent for us and our lives. So in the battle between the Old Testament and mythology, the Old Testament wins. If you're just joining us, you are listening to Evidence for Faith. I'm Keith Kendricks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis.
And we're going to turn to an interesting lecture that I heard by a man named Daniel Wallace. And Daniel Wallace is one of the leading New Testament scholars and an expert in the field of manuscript evidence for the New Testament. Now, there's another so-called expert out there by the name of Bart Ehrman. Ever heard of him? Well, we've talked about him in the past, so yes, you have. Don't be shaking your head over there. Bart Ehrman is one of these popularizers of things like the Gospel of Thomas and there were all these other Gospels, and that Christianity kind of picked and chose which versions of the Gospels they wanted, and they threw the other testimonies away. Well, that's completely untrue. There's no, other than about Bart Ehrman and one or two other scholars, every other major scholar, whether they're a skeptic or not, whether they're an atheist or not, thinks that Bart Ehrman is full of it. He just doesn't know what he's talking about. One of the things that Ehrman claims in his book is that there are no second century fragments. There's no first century fragments. There's no second century fragments. So in other words, there's no manuscript evidence until you get to the 3rd century. So that's what this talk was about. Daniel Wallace showed us that this is completely untrue. So he's just simply factually wrong And he's too actually good of a scholar to not know this evidence. So he's actually being dishonest because he's too high up there. He's too well educated. He's too knowledgeable to not know this. And he simply is stating things that are, talk about a counterfactual, something that's opposite to the truth. So how do we date papyri? I've always wanted to date a papyri. I don't know.
You have to compare them.
Oh, okay. Right.
You know, what's old, what's been, what's proven, and what may have come along a little bit later. So there might be a very, very minute difference. In a punctuation mark or...
Right, or how they shape the letters.
Right.
Yeah, those things change over time.
Right.
So they will very carefully analyze the fragments, the papyri, the shapes of the letters, and see see how it's changed over time and compare it to dates that they do know, that they have solid evidence for the dates. So that's how they figure out where these fragments are dated. So what's the real truth? Well, for first century, let's look at, there are 5 candidates for the first century. So that means there are 5 fragments of manuscripts that could be from the first century. Now, Barth says that there are no second century fragments, but we actually have some that actually could be from the first century. Now, the analysis of it is, and the weight of the evidence seems to indicate that they're probably not from the first century. But at least there is the possibility that they are from the first century. Okay, but if they're not from the first century, they are from the second century. In fact, there are numerous fragments that we have from the second century. 10 to 13 of them are either possibly or definitely, absolutely definitely from the second century. And then you go to the third century, and we have at least 39 manuscripts that are definitely from the third century. So not at all what Barth was talking about. Now, he explained an interesting phenomena that goes on in the archaeological realm about finding manuscripts. You know, for a while, when some of the early manuscripts were starting to turn up, they were showing some different readings. You know, you'd have a couple different words that were in this new manuscript that they just dug up. And so that's called a variant reading. Okay? So then you have to try to figure out, you have to examine the evidence to see which is the correct reading. You know, is this word that doesn't seem to be in other manuscripts, is that word actually in the original, or was that added sometime later? So in the early days, more than a couple centuries ago, when they would find a manuscript, there was a possibility that there might be a variant reading. He pointed out the fact that over the past 100 years, there have been no variant readings, no new variant readings discovered, even though there have been hundreds of new manuscripts, new fragments found. There are no more variant readings. So there hasn't been a variant reading discovered in over 100 years. So do you realize what that means about the manuscript evidence that we have for the New Testament?
Well, essentially it's going to mean that the new finds are confirming that what we have is a complete body of papyri.
Right, exactly. So, I was thinking of an example. It's like, let's say you are down here in Ocean City and you like to collect shells. So you begin your collection, and maybe every time you go to the beach, you find a new type of shell that can go in your collection. After a while, you go to the beach, and this time you didn't find anything new. You've already got everything that you see. And you keep going, but you keep going every day. And then after a while, it's weeks between a new find, and then it's months between a new find. Now, let's say that you've been searching the beach every single day. You've got this great, big, huge collection at home of all the different types of shells that will appear here on the New Jersey coastline. Now you've been 100 years going every single day, and you haven't found a new type of shell. Would you believe that your collection of shells was complete?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely you would. Of course you would. And that's the same thing with the New Testament, with the manuscript evidence. Isn't that should be very, very comforting to Christians, that nobody's going to find some variant, whacked out, weird manuscript that could pose some problem or some issue for determining what the Bible actually says.
And it's so obvious, when I think back to the Lionel trains that were made in the 50s, there were some boxcars that had 30 or more variants, whether it was the color of the roof or the color of the door or the main color, or the undercarriage was stamped. There were a whole bunch of different variants. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have a boxcar collection and there's 32 of them and it took you a lifetime to collect all of them,
right?
Guess what? There are no more. You have them all.
Right.
And then this is confirmed in a catalog where they have all of these variants cataloged and confirmed.
Right.
So if there's another one that pops up 20 years later, it's looked at critically by the
you would
restoration experts to see if it was doctored up or if
it was a fake, right?
If it was repainted. Exactly. That's exactly correct.
Yep. So we are very confident of the quality of the manuscripts that we have that make up the New Testament. So that was a terrific talk and well attended.
And the Dead Sea Scrolls basically confirmed. The Dead Sea Scrolls basically confirmed that what they had already collected.
Right.
Confirmed that there had been no tampering over the previous 2 centuries.
Right, with the Old Testament.
Exactly.
Exactly right. It's another fabulous find. Well, we've got time. I think we've got a few minutes left. Let's take a look at, there was another talk I went to about the resurrection. Now, this was a really interesting talk because what the lecturer was saying was that you only need 4 facts, 4 historical facts, to prove that the resurrection actually happened. So the 4 facts are the burial. Was Jesus buried or not? Fact is, he was. Second, the empty tomb. Okay, was the tomb actually empty? All the evidence points to that it was. It was actually empty. Number 3, were there appearances? Did people believe that they saw Jesus appear to them? Answer, yes, they did. And then 4th is, did the people who knew Jesus, the eyewitnesses, did they believe that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead? Did they believe it so strongly that they would be willing to die for it? So, and the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. So with those 4 facts, this gets rid of all of the other explanations, swoon theory and twin theory and all the different possible kind of explanations to get rid of the resurrection.
The body was stolen. The list goes on and on.
Exactly. But these 4 facts will refute any of those theories. So you only need 4 facts, and we do have them. So Jesus was buried. The tomb was found empty. He did appear. People claimed that they saw him, and people believed to the death that he did rise from the dead. And that is the best explanation. There's this concept out there called Occam's razor. Have you heard of that? Mm-hmm. Occam's razor is this way of deciding what's true. And it's the view is that you take the simplest explanation. What's the simplest explanation? For instance, if you and I are walking out hunting in the wintertime, and we come across some tracks in the snow, and they look like bear prints, okay, what should we decide? Should we decide that a bear just walked by there? Or should we have another more complicated theory that there were aliens who landed in a spacecraft and they walked by and their feet happened to look like bears' feet? Okay, how do you decide which is the right view to have?
The simplest and the most logical was that there was a bear.
Exactly right. That's Occam's razor. So Occam's razor is a very useful way of deciding between differing views. And this view is very clear. 4 simple facts. Jesus Christ did rise from the dead.
You know, Keith, one of the things that I want to ram home here, we know what happened to the 12 disciples. One hung himself. The 10 of them died a martyr's death, and John was the only one that didn't die a martyr's death, but he was burned and blinded because of his beliefs. Every one of them went to the grave because of their firm, realistic, knowledgeable belief.
Yep. Well, you've been listening to Evidence for Faith. I'm Keith Kendricks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Arakis.
Join us again next Sunday at 4 p.m. for more reasons to believe. And always remember that the best reason for being a Christian is because it's true.